What happens when the most feared man on the Detroit riverfront tries to break the one woman who keeps his secrets in a ledger? He came to watch her fold. Instead, the bookkeeper nobody ever looked at twice forced the king down onto the floor of his own club and made him stay there. This is a story about numbers, cruelty, and the kind of strength that doesn't fit in a tailored suit. The Cardinal Room always smelled like cold money, bourbon and beeswax candles, the faint sweetness of the orchids Mr. Pelham insisted on changing every morning, and underneath all of it, the river coming in through the loading door, silt and diesel and something older. Henrietta Doyle could tell what kind of night it was going to be, just by the way the smell shifted when the front doors opened. On the bad nights, the air went still, the piano kept playing, but the conversations dropped half a register, and the regulars at the bar suddenly remembered they had somewhere quieter to be. That was how she knew on a Thursday in late October that Cassian Vane had walked in before she ever looked up from her tray. Everybody in the city knew the name. Cassian Vane ran the riverfront the way other men ran a corner store, quietly, completely, and without ever appearing to lift a finger. On paper, he owned 3 shipping companies, a parking concern, 2 restaurants, and the Cardinal Room. Off paper, he owned a great deal more, including, it was whispered, a fair number of the men who were supposed to investigate him. He was 43 years old and he moved through the room like weather. 2 of his people came in behind him, Knox, who was built like a freezer and said maybe a dozen words a year, and a jumpy younger one named Cobb who never stopped scanning the corners. They took the booth in the back, the one that faced the door, the one nobody else was ever allowed to sit in. Etta wasn't supposed to be on the floor that night. She kept the books. She came in at 4, sat in the closet they generously called an office, and made the numbers behave until close. But the new girl had quit by text at 5, the other 2 were drowning, and Mr. Pelham had come to her with sweat already shining on his bald head, and his hands doing that nervous ringing thing. Etta, please, just the back section, just tonight. She'd looked at him over her reading glasses. You know what I cost you an hour to do this, Pelham? You're losing money the second I stand up. I'll lose a lot more if those tables sit empty when he gets here, Pelham had whispered, and that had ended the conversation, because they both knew who he meant. So now she was tying an apron over a body that aprons were not designed for, smoothing it down over a stomach and hips she'd long ago stopped apologizing for, and carrying a tray of waters across a room that had gone quiet for a man she'd never actually met. She'd seen him, of course. She'd seen his money for 2 years. She knew the exact size of his tabs, the brand of cigar he had shipped in from Tampa, the standing comp Pelham logged every month under a line item Etta had personally renamed donations out of spite. She knew Cassian Vane better than most of the people who shook his hand. She just knew him as a column. She set the waters down. Evening, gentlemen. Get you started with something while you look. He didn't pick up the menu. He didn't need to. He owned the kitchen. What he did was let his eyes travel up from her shoes, slow the way men like him did when they wanted you to feel measured and found short. His face was the kind of handsome that had clearly never once worked against him, dark hair going silver at the temples, a jaw you could have struck a match on, eyes the grey of a knife left out in the rain. He looked at her the way you'd look at a piece of furniture that had been delivered to the wrong address. Pelham, he said. He didn't raise his voice. He never had to. I pay this place a great deal of attention. I expect a certain standard at my table. He let the words settle over the nearby tables like ash. Did the agency send me a waitress, or did they ship me the whole catering truck? Cobb laughed, sharp and ugly. Knox didn't, but the corner of his mouth moved. At the next table, a woman in pearls pressed her napkin to her lips to hide a smile, and her husband studied his wine. Etta had heard cruelty her whole life. She'd heard it in middle school hallways and in waiting rooms and from a stepfather who measured love in pounds. She'd built something underneath her skin a long time ago, something that didn't crack when men like this came swinging. What surprised her, what genuinely surprised her, was the cold little ember of fury that lit in her chest. Not because it hurt, because it was lazy. Because a man this powerful couldn't even be bothered to come up with something original. She didn't flush. She didn't stammer. She picked up his usual bottle from the table, the pappy he kept stashed behind the bar, the one Pelham had already brought out the second the man crossed the threshold, and she held it up to the candlelight, turning it slowly, like an appraiser. That's a beautiful bottle, Mr. Vane, she said, in the calm, unhurried voice she used on auditors. Shame about what's in it. The smirk on his face flickered. Excuse me, your bottle gets opened the first of the month and it's supposed to last you to the next first. She set it down gently, dead center on the table like a chess piece. Funny thing about a bottle that pours that much. It runs dry around the 20th every single time. Then it's full again by the 25th, and nobody orders a replacement, and nobody logs one, and the level's always exactly where you left it. She smiled, pleasant as Sunday. Somebody in this building is watering down the king's whiskey and pocketing the difference. 2 years now. I just figured the king should know he's been drinking his own tap water at 400 a glass. For a moment, the only sound in the cardinal room was the piano player, feeling his way through something slow and the slow drip of ice melting somewhere. Cobb had stopped laughing. Knox had gone very still, the way a big animal goes still when it isn't sure yet what it's looking at. And Cassian Vane, the man the whole riverfront held its breath for, was staring at the heavy-set bookkeeper in the borrowed apron as though she'd just spoken to him in a language he'd thought was extinct. He leaned forward. "And who exactly?" he said softly. "Are you? I'm the person who knows where every dollar in your favorite room goes, Mr. Vane." She tucked her tray under her arm, including the ones you'd rather nobody counted. "Now, can I get you something from the bar?" I'd skipped the pappy. She turned and walked away. She could feel his eyes on the whole length of her back, on the sway of her, all the way to the kitchen doors. She kept her chin level and her steps even, and the second the doors swung shut behind her, she grabbed the steel edge of the prep counter and stood there shaking, breathing through her teeth, because her heart was going like a trapped bird, and her knees had just informed her they'd quit a sentence ago. "Are you out of your mind?" Pelham had materialized beside her, grey as putty. "Do you have any idea? That man, Etta, he could have us all in the river by Friday." "He's a bully with a parking garage and a gun," she said, though her hands were trembling so hard she had to press them flat on the counter. But she knew better. She'd just painted a target on her own back with a brush dipped in the only thing she had, the truth about his money. And men like Cassian Vane did not forgive being the only one in the room who didn't know the joke. When his party left 2 hours later, Etta went to clear the booth herself. Under the empty rocks glass sat a $100 bill, crisp enough to cut a finger on, and beneath it, on the back of one of the club's cream cocktail napkins, 3 lines in a hard, slanting hand. "You've got a sharp little mouth, bookkeeper, and sharp things have a way of getting used up." V. She read it twice. Then she folded it into quarters and tucked it into her bra, where she kept the things she wasn't ready to think about yet, and she finished bussing the table, because the rent was due and her brother's clinic in Toledo didn't run on principle. What came next, the regulars would later swear, was the strangest courtship the East Side had ever produced, though nobody used that word at the time. For 2 weeks, Cassian Vane made the Cardinal Room his personal stage, and Etta Doyle his unwilling co-star. He came in for lunch, which he never did. He requested her section, which made no sense for a man who'd just learned she was the bookkeeper. He found small surgical ways to make her squeeze her body past chairs he'd nudged into the aisle, and watched her do it with a flat, unreadable patience. He sent dishes back and made her carry them. He left in place of tips brochures for a luxury gym on the 2nd day, for a wellness retreat on the 4th, for a tailor who works in difficult sizes on the 6th, and he watched her face each time she found them, looking for the crack. She never gave him one. When he left the gym brochure, she made a $200 donation to a no-kill animal shelter in his name, and taped the framed thank you certificate to the wall above his booth, where he'd have to look at Cassian Vane, friend to forgotten creatures, every time he sat down. When he complained loudly that the booth was too cramped for someone of her considerable footprint, she came back with a tape measure and offered in front of his men to measure him for a booster seat so he could feel taller. Cobb had to leave the room. Knox's shoulders shook once, silently, before he got control of himself. What none of them understood, what she didn't understand, lying awake at 2 in the morning in her drafty 1-bedroom on Helen Street, fighting with a radiator that knocked like a man who wanted in, was why it was happening at all. Cassian Vane could have had her fired with a phone call. He could have had her disappeared with a nod. Instead, he kept coming back to be insulted by a woman he was supposed to be able to crush by existing. The truth, which he wouldn't have admitted under torture and didn't fully understand himself, was simpler and worse than anything she imagined. For 10 years, every person who'd entered Cassian Vane's orbit had performed for him. They flattered, They flinched. Beautiful women he'd never asked for arranged themselves on his arm like accessories and laughed before he finished his jokes. Men who hated him called him brother. He had built an empire out of fear and discovered, somewhere around year 5, that fear is the loneliest currency in the world because nothing it buys you is real. And then, a full-figured bookkeeper in a borrowed apron had looked him in the eye, told him he'd been drinking his own tap water, and walked away without checking whether she was still allowed to. He couldn't stop thinking about it. It made him furious. He wanted to break her the way you want to test a thing you don't believe is real, just to prove it'll shatter like everything else. It didn't shatter, it got sharper, and every day it didn't break, it got harder for him to look away. The thing about that 2-week war, though, was that it had an audience neither of them had counted on. Roland Pike ran what was left of the old North End operation, and what was left wasn't much, which made Roland Pike exactly as dangerous as a cornered dog. For a year he'd been pushing south, leaning on businesses that were supposed to be under Vane's protection, testing the fences. Word had gotten back to him, through a city councilman named Hale, who took envelopes from anyone who filled them, that the untouchable Cassian Vane had developed a soft spot the size of a bookkeeper, a weakness, a door left open. Pike decided to walk through it. It started small. The Brannick brothers came into the Cardinal Room on a slow Tuesday, the kind of night the floor was nearly empty, and Etta had stayed late to close out the month. Sean Brannick and Dale Brannick were collectors by trade, 2 slabs of scar tissue and bad intentions who'd broken more bones than they'd had hot meals. Pelham had locked himself in the back office an hour earlier, and Etta was alone at the bar with her ledger and a glass of the watered-down pappy she'd kept out of pure principle when Sean Brannick put both hands flat on the wood and leaned in. "Where's Pelham, sweetheart?" She didn't look up. "Closed. You'll want to leave." Dale circled toward the hallway that led to the office, his boots leaving wet half-moons on the carpet. "We know he's back there. Pike's owed 3 weeks. The Cardinal Room's behind on its insurance that stopped her pen." The Cardinal Room paid Vane for protection, paid it through her, in fact, in a line she'd buried so deep in the books, even the IRS would have needed a flashlight. If Pike's men were collecting here, it meant Pelham had been paying 2 masters, or it meant a war was about to start in her city. And either way it meant she was now standing between 2 men who broke femurs for a living and the only door out. She set her pen down and slid off the stool. Standing, she put herself square in the mouth of the hallway. "I said we're closed." Sean looked her over and laughed. A flat, mean sound. "Look at the size of it. Thinks it's a door." He shoved her, a hard, contemptuous push to the shoulder, the kind meant to fold a person in half and send her scrambling. He'd misjudged. He'd badly misjudged, the way men always did. Etta Doyle had spent 31 years carrying a body the world treated as an inconvenience, and one of the things she had learned, deep in the architecture of her, was how to be hard to move. She rocked back on her heels, absorbed it, and didn't go down. A rack of glasses behind her took the worst of it. They came off the shelf and shattered across the floor, a bright spray of pain across her shins, and she felt the warm sting of a cut open up below her knee. Adrenaline ate the pain whole. "Don't," she said, and her voice came out low and even and strange to her own ears. "Put your hands on me again." Her fingers closed around the neck of the doctored pappy bottle. "I will open you up like a Christmas card." Dale pulled a folding knife from his jacket and the blade came out with a click that seemed very loud in the empty room. And then the front doors of the Cardinal Room blew open hard enough to crack glass, and Cassian Vane was standing in the frame with rain coming off his coat in sheets, and his face had stopped being handsome. It had become something else entirely, flat, focused, ancient. Knox and Cobb were a half step behind him, and their guns were already out. "Knife on the floor, Dale." Vane didn't shout. The words landed like a dropped anvil anyway. "I won't say it twice, and I never say it twice." The Brannicks froze. They knew exactly who they were looking at. Sean's hands came up, slow. "This ain't your fight, Vane. Pike says the Cardinal's his now. Pelham's into us. Pike doesn't own the dirt I scrape off my shoes," Vane said, and he stepped inside into the candlelight and the temperature of the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. His grey eyes flicked just once, to Etta, to the blood running down her shin, the broken glass, the bottle still gripped in her white-knuckled fist, and something moved behind his face that none of his men had ever seen before and would never mention again. "And nobody," he said very softly, "comes into my house, breaks my glass, and lays a hand on what's mine. Mine." Etta's jaw tightened even through the fear. She was not a line item in anyone's ledger. She was not his. She didn't get the chance to say so. Vane moved, and for a man in a $1,000 coat, he moved like something let off a chain. He crossed to Dale in 2 strides. He didn't reach for a gun. He caught the wrist with the knife and turned it the wrong way until something in it gave with a wet, gristly pop. And as Dale screamed and the blade hit the carpet, Vane brought a knee up into his face and put him on the floor in a spreading dark puddle. Out cold. Sean lunged, and Knox was simply there, the cold round mouth of a suppressor pressed up under his ear. Vane crouched and plucked a single shard of glass off his sleeve, examining it. "Carry your brother out," he told Sean, conversational. "And tell Roland Pike that if he sends his dogs into my rooms again, I'll send them back in a box that fits through a mail slot. Go." Sean Brannick hauled his unconscious brother up by the collar and dragged him out into the rain, and the doors swung shut, and the Cardinal room was nothing but the storm and the dripping, and the piano player who, it turned out, had been hiding under his own bench the entire time and now slowly raised his head. Vane turned. Etta was backed against the bar, the bottle finally lowered, blood drying on her leg, her hair come loose from its pins, breathing like she'd run a mile. He crossed to her slowly. The danger came off him in waves. She could feel it on her skin. He stopped close, too close, close enough that she could smell rain and cedar, and under it, gun smoke. And he reached up and pressed the side of his hand, almost gently, to her jaw, tilting her face toward the light to look at the cut on her cheekbone she hadn't even known was there. The tenderness of it, from those hands that had just folded a man like wet laundry, sent a confusing jolt straight down her spine that made her hate herself a little. "You're bleeding," he said. "I'm fine." She knocked his hand away and despised the small tremor in her own voice. "I didn't ask for the cavalry." His eyes went dark, the softness gone as fast as it had come, the old arrogance sliding back over his face like a portcullis. He leaned in until his mouth was an inch from her ear. "You were about 30 seconds from being gutted on your own ledger, bookkeeper," he murmured, velvet over a blade. "I just saved your life. There are men who'd be on their knees right now thanking me for less." He pulled back and looked down at her with that familiar, mocking patience. "Go on, show me you've got some sense in you, Kneal." Etta looked at him. She could taste copper where she'd bitten the inside of her cheek when she hit the bar. She looked at this beautiful, terrible man, who thought he could buy her dignity the way he bought everything else, wholesale, with fear, and she did the only thing she had left. She set the bottle down on the bar, and then, very deliberately, she dropped a cocktail napkin onto his rain-soaked, blood-flecked Italian shoe. "For the mess," she said. Her voice didn't shake at all this time. "I don't kneel, Mr. Vane, not for men who have to scare people into respecting them. That's not respect, that's just rent." The Cardinal room held its breath. He didn't hit her. He didn't raise his voice. A muscle moved once in his jaw, and something flared up in the grey of his eyes deep down. Not anger, or not only anger, but a kind of dangerous, starving wonder, the look of a man who has found something he didn't believe still existed. He looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. All of her, every inch she refused to apologize for. "We'll see," he said quietly, and he turned and walked back out into the rain. The following Monday, Pelham was gone. In his place, a smooth young attorney named Whitmore stood in the middle of the dining room at noon and informed the staff that the Cardinal room had been brought fully in-house under Vane Holdings, effective immediately. Etta's stomach dropped into her shoes. He hadn't just escalated their little war. He'd bought the battlefield. He owned the floor she stood on now, the paychecks, the ledger, her ledger, and her name on a W-2 that he could erase. And then, strangely, the torment stopped. No more brochures, no more nudged chairs, no more performances. Instead, Cassian Vane simply came in and sat in his booth beneath the framed certificate that named him a friend to forgotten creatures. And he watched her work. His grey eyes followed her across the room, tracked the confident pivot of her on her feet, the way she hoisted the heavy register trays the busboys complained about, the way the whole staff drifted to her when something went wrong, because she was the one who always knew where everything was. The silence was so much worse than the cruelty. It was the patience of a man standing outside a locked door, listening, learning the shape of the mechanism in no hurry at all. But Etta's defiance had rippled out past the walls of the Cardinal room, and the ripples were coming back as a wave. Roland Pike had lost face. The broken jaw Vane had handed Dale Brannick was an act of war, and Pike was not a man who answered an act of war with a phone call. The whisper on the riverfront, fed by Councilman Hale and his envelopes, said the untouchable Cassian Vane had finally, after 10 careful years, given the world a place to hit him. A heavy-set bookkeeper on Helen Street, a door left open. They came for her on a cold night 2 weeks later. Etta had just gotten her key into the lock of her apartment, shivering, her cheap coat no match for the wind coming off the river, when she registered that the hallway was too dark. The bulb had been smashed. She felt the grit of it under her shoe. Before she could turn, a hand the size of a dinner plate clamped over her mouth, stinking of cigarettes and motor oil, and shoved her through her own front door into the black. "Not a sound, fat girl," a voice breathed against her ear. The door kicked shut behind her. There were two of them. She could feel it, the heat of two big bodies, and when her eyes adjusted, she made out Sean Brannick, his face still mottled with bruising from the last time, and a stranger built like a refrigerator with a face dropped on top. Panic rose up her throat and she stamped it down hard. 31 years of being a target had taught her one law she lived by. She was not small, and she would not act small. "Pike wants Vane to watch," Sean said, pulling a revolver from his waistband, his teeth showing in the dark. "We're gonna do you slow, and then we're gonna do him. He gets to watch his little secret bleed out on the linoleum." He shoved her toward the center of the room, hard, expecting her to stumble and crumple. He'd made the same mistake his brother had. He underestimated her center of gravity. Etta planted her feet, both of them, sturdy, sure, and took the shove without going over. And then she used the momentum, spinning into it, swinging her heavy work bag in a flat arc with everything she had. The strap held. The corner of it, where she kept a roll of quarters for the laundromat, caught Sean across the temple with a crack like a bat on a fast ball. And he went sideways into the wall, the revolver tumbling out of his hand into the dark. The refrigerator lunged, wrapping both arms around her waist, trying to take her down to the floor. Etta did not go down. She let out a sound she didn't know she had in her, low and furious, and she threw all of herself backward, driving him into the wall behind her so hard the plaster cracked and the breath left him in a single broken wheeze. She was not a thing to be plucked and snapped. She was a stone rolling downhill. She drove her elbow back into his ribs once, twice, but Sean was up again, blood sheeting down the side of his face, and he grabbed the floor lamp and swung it. It caught her across the shoulder, and the world went white with pain, and she dropped to her knees on her own cold floor, vision swimming, her arm gone dead. Sean racked the revolver and put the barrel against her forehead. "Cute," he panted, blood in his teeth. "Real cute. Lights out, sweetheart." The gunshot was so loud it took her hearing with it. The pain never came. Instead, Sean Brannick's eyes rolled white and he folded down onto her cheap linoleum like a dropped coat, and standing in the doorway, swaying, was Cassian Vane. His coat was torn open. The whole left side of his shirt was going dark and wet fast. He had a suppressed pistol in one hand with smoke ghosting off it, and no knocks, no cob. They'd been pulled off him somewhere below, she'd learn later, drawn away by Pike's people so the boss would come up these stairs alone. The refrigerator, realizing the king himself had walked into the room hurt and unguarded, abandoned Etta and charged him with a knife. Vane raised the gun, but the bullet already in his side made him slow, just slow enough, and the big man crashed into him and bore him back into the narrow hallway. The pistols skittered out of his grip and spun away under the radiator. The refrigerator got his weight settled and raised the blade for Vane's throat. "Hey!" Etta didn't look for a weapon. She didn't have time to be a person with a plan. She came up off the floor with her dead arm and her screaming shoulder and threw the entire weight of herself across the room and into the side of the man with the knife, shoulder first, the way she'd seen her brother do it on a football field 100 years ago. The impact lifted him clean off Cassian Vane and carried them both into her notoriously broken radiator. The old cast iron groaned, and the rusted joint she'd been begging the landlord to fix for 2 winters finally sheared off, and a jet of scalding water erupted into the man's face. He shrieked, clawing blind, and scrambled up and fled down the stairs into the night, leaving nothing behind but the hiss of steam and 2 people breathing hard in the dark. Etta pushed herself up. Her uniform was torn, her shoulder was a furnace, and she could feel the wet heat of the burst pipe soaking the hem of her coat. She crossed to where Cassian Vane was slumped against the wall, one hand pressed to the dark, spreading flood at his side, his face gone the color of ash. The arrogance was gone, the weather was gone. He looked for the first time in 10 years like a man. "You," he rasped, staring up at her like she was something he couldn't account for. "You came back at him. You should have run. Yeah, well." She was already on her knees beside him, yanking a clean dish towel off the oven handle and pressing it hard into the wound, ignoring the way he flinched. Let's see one of those skinny model girls you keep around carry your dead weight down 4 flights before the cops show. Hold this. Press. She got her good arm under him and hauled. He was solid muscle, dead weight and heavy, and her shoulders screamed. But she got him up, and she got his arm over her shoulders, and she braced him against the wide, sturdy plane of her own hip. And Cassian Vane, the king of the riverfront, who had not leaned on another living soul since he was old enough to know better, leaned the whole broken weight of himself on a plus-size bookkeeper from Helen Street, and let her carry him out into the rain. His safe house was a sterile glass box on the top floor of a building downtown that Etta knew, from the books, he technically didn't own. She got him into the private elevator, and he passed out against the mirrored wall somewhere around the 30th floor. Knox and Cobb came spilling in 20 minutes later, faces grey with the particular shame of men who'd been pulled off their post, dragging a doctor who didn't ask questions and went straight to work, digging Pike's bullet out from between the king's ribs. Etta sat in the enormous dim living room on a leather sofa that cost more than a year of her rent, ruined and bruised, and wearing a stranger's blood over her own, and she thought about leaving. She had enough in the coffee can in her freezer to put her on a bus to anywhere. Nobody would have blamed her, but some stubborn magnet held her where she was, and she couldn't have explained it if her brother's life depended on it, which, she reminded herself bitterly, it did. 2 hours later, the bedroom door opened and Cassian Vane came out. He was bare to the waist, wrapped in white bandages across his ribs, in nothing but dark slacks, and without the armor of his suit he looked rawer and somehow younger and far more dangerous. He crossed the room slowly, wincing at every step until he stood over where she sat. "The doctor says I lost most of what I had in me," he said, and his voice, that voice he weaponized, was rougher and quieter than she'd ever heard it. "He says if you hadn't put pressure on it, if you hadn't carried me down, I'd have bled out on your kitchen floor next to that radiator you keep complaining about. I'll mail you the dry cleaning bill," she said, refusing to drop his eyes. "And the plumbing estimate." He didn't laugh. He looked down at her, at the wide, unapologetic body she'd armored her whole life, the strong shoulders that had just thrown a grown man into a wall, the soft fullness of her she had been taught to hate by men exactly like him, and the mockery she'd come to expect from him simply wasn't there. In its place was something she had no file for, something that looked, impossibly, like reverence. "Why?" he asked, very low. "Did you fight for me? I've done nothing but try to break you since the day I met you, because I'm not you." It came out shaking, the adrenaline still loose in her blood. "You think power means making people smaller. You looked at me and saw a target, because I don't fit in your tailored little world. I fought because I don't let bullies win. Not Pike's animals, and not you." He took a step closer. Even hurt, even bandaged, the heat of him reached her. "I didn't come after you because you don't fit," he said, and the words came out of him like they had to be torn loose, like they cost him blood to say. "I came after you because you were the only real thing I'd seen in 10 years. Everyone lies to me, bookkeeper. They bow, they scrape, they laugh before I finish. And then you stood at my table and told me I'd been drinking my own tap water and walked off without checking if I'd let you live." His jaw worked. "I wanted to break you to prove you were like the rest of them. You wouldn't break, you just kept getting harder to look away from." He reached up and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear with a hand that had killed men that same night. "You're not a target," he said. "You're the only person in this city who ever told me the truth. And I was too arrogant to see what that was worth until I was bleeding out on your floor, and you were the one standing between me and the dark." Etta stood up. She put herself an inch from him, the full of her nearly against the bandages on his ribs, and she did not melt, and she did not soften, and she kept her spine straight as a plumb line. "Words are cheap, Mr. Vane," she said, and her low voice carried a weight now that filled the whole glass room. "You told me my mouth was too sharp for a big girl. You told me to kneel. You thought my dress size meant my pride came at a discount." She watched the shame move across his face, vivid and, for once, real. "You said it on the floor of your own club in front of your men where everybody could hear." "I was wrong," he said. "Flat. No theater in it." "Prove it," she said. The silence stretched out through the glass box, heavy and total, the lights of the city scattered below them like spilled change. Cassian Vane was the king of the riverfront. He answered to no one. He bowed to no one. He had buried men for less than a raised eyebrow. And he looked into the fierce dark eyes of the woman who had emptied a pot of scalding water into a killer's face to keep his throat in one piece. And then, Slowly, with a grimace that had nothing to do with the bullet wound, the king began to lower himself. He ignored the searing pain in his side. He went down past her until his knees met the cold-poured concrete of the floor, and he was at her feet, looking up at the full-figured bookkeeper, who had shattered something in him and built it back in her own shape. He took her thick, capable hands in both of his and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, reverent, like a man at an altar. "I'm on my knees, Henrietta," he said, and his voice did not shake, but something behind it did. "I'm sorry. I'm yours. Tell me what you want." Etta looked down at the most feared man on the east side, his pride finally on the floor where she'd been told her whole life that hers belonged. A slow, sure smile spread across her face. She freed one hand and reached down to cup his jaw, lifting his eyes to hers. "Good," she said softly. "Now get up off that bad knee before you tear your stitches." She held his gaze, and the smile sharpened into something Pike, 2 miles north, and just now hearing that his men had failed, would have been very wise to fear. "We've got a councilman to buy out from under Roland Pike, and I know exactly which envelopes to follow. After all," she pulled him up to his feet, steadying all that weight against her hip the way she had on the stairs, like it was nothing, like it had always been hers to carry. "I'm the one who keeps the books."